Welcome back to GCC Kids Connection, where we are connecting with each other while you're home from school. We're connecting with some really cool books, and most importantly, we're connecting with God's Word. We're so glad you're here.
All right, kids, welcome back. We're glad to have you here with us. We're going to begin another chapter book today, and this chapter book is going to take us through the next 2 weeks. And I chose this book because it is my all-time favorite book to read aloud to kids. You've probably heard it, or maybe one of your teachers at school has read it to you, or you might have read it to yourself at home. But it's one of my favorite books. It's called Charlotte's Web. And so we're going to begin today with chapter 1 in Charlotte's Web called Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arble. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it'll never amount to anything, so your father's decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arble put the pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father is right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed the chair out of her way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arble stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "That's a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arble, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do, and a weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," said Fern. "The pig can't help it if it was born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arble smiled. "Well, certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I have ever heard of." An odd look came over John Arble's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I'll bring that runt in when I come. I'll let you start it on a bottle like a baby, and then you'll see how much trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arble returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arble. Mr. Arble set the carton down at Fern's place, and then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying, and as she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching sound. Fern looked at her father, and then she lifted the lid of the carton, and there inside, looking up out at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one, and the morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arble, "saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, then she kissed her mother, then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out, and held it against her cheek. At that moment, her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed, an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arble. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it." said Avery, setting his gun down. You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. Why, it's no bigger than a white rat. Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery, said his mother. The school bus will be along in half an hour. Can I have a pig too, Pop? Asked Avery. No, I only distribute pigs to early risers, said Mr. Arble. Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice, and as a result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. Just shows what can happen when a person gets up promptly. Let's eat. But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arble found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber nipple. She poured warm milk into the bottle, fixed the nipple on top, and handed it to Fern. Give him his breakfast, she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from a bottle. The baby, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked out by the road. Run, commanded Mrs. Arble, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a donut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another donut. The children ran out to the road and climbed up into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others on the bus. She just sat and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pig, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. Its name is Wilbur, she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, Fern, what's the capital of Pennsylvania? Wilbur, replied Fern dreamily. The pupils giggled, and Fern blushed. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk and tied a bib on and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and then again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arble gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away at school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in the box near the stove in the kitchen. Then Mrs. Arble complained, and he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arble fixed him a small yard specially for Wilbur under the apple tree and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut into it so he could walk into it. Won't he get cold at night? Asked Fern. No, said her father. You watch and see what he does. Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily toward the box. Fern peered in through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout, and in a short time he had dug a tunnel in the straw. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was enchanted. It relieved her mind to know that her baby would sleep covered up and would stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her till the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it was out of sight. While Fern was at school, Wilbur was shut up in his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she would take him out, and he would follow her all over the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur waited at the bottom until she came back down. Wilbur followed along. Sometimes on those journeys, Wilbur would get tired, and Fern would pick him up and put her in the carriage alongside her doll. He liked this, and if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked so cute with his eyes closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly so that she would not wake up her sleeping infants. One summer afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged along after Fern. When she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking, so while the children swam and played and splashed the water at each other, Wilbur just amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. Every day was happy, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means he was born in the springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arble said he was now big enough to sell, and he would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, but her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased, and he was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to his milk. Mr. Arble was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. "He's gotta go, Fern," he said. "You've had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has to be sold." "Call up the Zuckermans," suggested Mrs. Arble to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him any time you like." "How much money should I ask for him?" Fern wanted to know. "Well," said her father, "he's a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer that you've got a pig you'll sell him for $6 and see what he says." It was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer, and her Uncle Homer came in from the barn to talk to Fern. When he heard that the price was only $6, he said sure, he'd buy the pig. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in the manure pile in the cellar of Zuckerman's barn. The barn was very large. It was very old, and it smelled of hay and manure. It smelled of the perspiration of tired horses and the wonderful sweet breath of patient cows. It often had sort of a peaceful smell, as though nothing bad could ever happen in the world. It smelled of grain and of harness dressing and of axle grease and of rubber boots and of old rope. And whenever the cat was given a fish head to eat, the barn would smell like a fish. But mostly it just smelled of hay, for there was always hay in the great loft overhead, and there was always hay to pitch down for the cows and the horses and the sheep. The barn was pleasant and warm in the winter when the animals spent most of their time indoors, and it was pleasantly cool in the summer when the big doors stood wide open to the breeze. The barn had stalls in the main floor for the workhorses, tie-ups on the main floor for the cows, a sheepfold down below for sheep, and a pig pen down below for Wilbur. And it was full of all sorts of things that you would find in a barn: ladders, grindstones, pitchforks, monkey wrenches, scythes, lawn mowers, snow shovels, axe handles, milk pails, water buckets, empty grain sacks, and rusty rat traps. It was the kind of barn that swallows like to build their nests in. It was the kind of barn that children liked to play in, and the whole thing was owned by Fern's uncle, Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman. Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile was a good place to keep a young pig. Pigs need warmth, and it was warm and comfortable down there in the barn cellar on the south side. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and she placed the stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during the long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep soon got to know her and trust her, and so did the geese who lived with the sheep. All the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and friendly. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and he did not allow her to get into the pig pen, but he told Fern that she could sit on that stool and watch Wilbur as long as she wanted to. It made her happy just to be near the pig, and it made Wilbur happy to know that she was sitting there right outside his pen. But he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims. One afternoon in June, when Wilbur was almost 2 months old, he wandered out into the small yard outside the barn. Fern had not arrived for her usual visit. Wilbur stood in the sun, feeling lonesome and bored. There's never anything to do around here, he thought. He walked slowly to his food trough and sniffed to see if anything had been overlooked at lunch. He found a small strip of potato skin and ate it. His back itched, so he leaned against the fence and rubbed against the boards. When he tired of this, he walked indoors, climbed to the top of the manure pile, and fell asleep. He didn't feel like going to sleep, but he didn't feel like digging, and he was tired of standing still or lying down. I'm less than 2 months old, and I'm tired of living, he said. He walked out into the yard again. When I'm out here, he said, there's no place to go but in. And when I'm indoors, there's no place to go but out here in the yard. That's where you're wrong, my friend, said a voice. Wilbur looked through the fence and saw the goose standing there. You don't have to stay in this dirty little yard, said the goose, who talked rather fast. One of the boards is loose. Push on it, push, 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 and go on out. What, said Wilbur? Say it slower. At the risk of repeating myself, said the goose, I suggest that you come out. It's wonderful out here. Did you say a board was loose? That I did, said the goose. Wilbur walked up to the fence and saw that the goose was right. One board was loose. He put his head down, shut his eyes, and pushed. The board gave way. In a minute, he had squeezed through the fence and was standing in the long grass outside his yard. The goose chuckled. How does it feel to be free? She asked. I like it, said Wilbur. That is, I guess I like it, actually. Wilbur felt kind of odd to be outside of his fence with nothing between him and the big world. Where do you think I'd better go? Anywhere you like, said the goose. Go down to the orchard, root up the sod, go down to the garden, dig up the radishes, root up everything, eat grass, look at the corn, look at the oats, run over, run, skip and dance, jump and prance. Go down through the orchard and stroll through the woods. The world is a wonderful place when you're a young pig. I can see that, replied Wilbur. He gave a jump in the air, twirled around, ran a few steps, and stopped. Looked all around, sniffed the smells of the afternoon, and then set off walking toward the orchard. Pausing in the shade of the apple tree, he put his snout down into the ground and began pushing and digging and rooting. He felt very happy. He had plowed quite a piece of ground before anyone noticed him. Mrs. Zuckerman was the first to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window, and immediately she shouted for the men. Homer! She shouted, pigs out! Lurvy! Pigs out! Homer! Lurvy! Pigs out! He's down under the apple tree. Now the trouble starts, thought Wilbur. Now I'm going to catch it. The goose heard the racket, and she too started hollering. Run, run, run! Downhill! Make for the woods! Make for the woods! She shouted to Wilbur. They'll never, never, never catch you in the woods! The cocker spaniel heard the commotion, and he ran out from the barn to join the chase. Mr. Zuckerman heard, and he came out from the machine shed where he had been mending a tool. Lurvy, the hired man, heard the noise and came up from the asparagus patch where he was pulling weeds. Everyone walked toward Wilbur, and Wilbur didn't know what to do. The woods seemed like a long way off, and anyway, he'd never been down there before, and he wasn't sure he would like it. Get around behind him, Lurvy, said Mr. Zuckerman, and drive him toward the barn. And I'll take it easy. Don't rush him. I'll go get a bucket of slops. The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals on the place. Whenever any creature broke loose on Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to the others. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. And then one of the cows told one of the sheep, and soon all the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers. The horses in the stalls in the barn pricked up their ears, and they heard the goose hollering, and soon the horses had caught on that something had happened. Wilbur's out, they said. Every animal stirred and lifted their heads and became excited to know that one of their friends had gotten free and was no longer penned up. Wilbur didn't know what to do or which way to run. It seemed as though everybody was after him. If this was what it was like to be free, he thought, I believe I'd rather be back in my yard. The cocker spaniel was sneaking up on him from one side, and Lurvy, the hired man, was sneaking up on him from the other side, Mrs. Zuckerman stood ready to head him off if he should start for the garden. And now Mr. Zuckerman was coming down toward him, carrying a pail. "This is really awful," thought Wilbur. "Why doesn't Fern come?" And he began to cry. The goose took command and began giving orders. "Don't just stand there, Wilbur. Dodge about," called the goose. "Skip and run, turn around, slip in and out. Make it for the woods, turn and twist." The cocker spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind leg. Wilbur jumped and ran. Lurvy reached out to grab him. Mrs. Zuckerman screamed at Lurvy. The goose cheered for Wilbur, and Wilbur dodged between Lurvy's legs. Lurvy missed, and Wilbur grabbed he missed Wilbur and grabbed the cocker spaniel. Nicely done, cried the goose. Try it again. "Run downhill," suggested the cows. "Run toward me," said the gander. "Run uphill," cried the sheep. "Turn and twist," honked the goose. "Jump and dance," said the rooster. "Look out, Lurvy," called the cows. "Look out for Zuckerman," yelled the gander. "Watch out for the dog," cried the sheep. Listen to me," screamed the goose. Poor Wilbur was dazed and frightened by this hullabaloo. He didn't like being the center of all this fuss. He tried to follow the instructions of his friends, but he couldn't run downhill and uphill at the same time, and he couldn't turn and twist when he was jumping and dancing, and he was crying so hard he could barely see anything that was happening. After all, Wilbur was a very young pig, not much more than a baby, really. He wished Fern were there to take him in her arms and comfort him. Then he looked up and saw Mr. Zuckerman standing close by, holding a pail of warm slops. He felt relieved. He lifted his nose and sniffed. The smell was delicious. Warm milk, potato skins, wheat middlings, Kellogg's cornflakes, and a popover left over from Mr. Zuckerman's breakfast. "Come, Pig," said Mr. Zuckerman, tapping the pail. "Come on, Pig." Wilbur took a step toward the pail. No, shouted the goose. "It's the old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back to captivity. He's appealing to your stomach." Wilbur didn't care. The food smelled appetizing. He took another step toward the pail. "Pig, Pig," said Mr. Zuckerman in a kind voice, and he began walking slowly toward the barnyard, looking all about him innocently as if he didn't know a little white pig was following after him. "You'll be sorry," called the goose. Wilbur didn't care. He kept walking toward the pail of slops. "You'll miss your freedom," honked the goose. "An hour of freedom is worth a barrel of slops." Wilbur didn't care. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence and poured the slops into the trough. Then he pushed the loose board away from the fence so that it was wide enough for Wilbur to walk through. Reconsider, cried the goose. Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence into the yard. He walked to his trough and took a long drink of slops, sucking in the milk hungrily and chewing the popover. Lurvy fetched a hammer and some 8-penny nails and nailed the board in place. Then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence, and Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with a stick. "He's quite a pig," said Lurvy. "Yes, he's a good pig," said Mr. Zuckerman. Wilbur heard the words of praise, and he felt the warm milk inside his stomach. He felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick against his itchy back. He felt peaceful and happy and sleepy. This had been a tiring afternoon. It was still only about 4 o'clock, but Wilbur was ready for bed. "I'm really too young to go out into the world alone," he thought as he lay down. Well, that's the beginning of our story called Charlotte's Web. There's an activity sheet that goes along with the first couple chapters of Charlotte's Web that you can download from the internet. Keep in mind as we're reading this story that the setting for this story takes place probably about 75 years ago, about the time when your grandparents would have been growing up, or maybe even your great-great-grandparents were growing up. So some of the things that you're going to hear in the story might be things that are unfamiliar to you. Like, for example, when Mr. when Mr. Arble came in for breakfast, he washed his hands and dried them on a roller towel. What in the world is a roller towel? See if you can find out what a roller towel is. There are some other words that are on your activity sheet for you to look up and find out what they are. And then we're going to make some connections from this story from truths that we find in the Bible. Because you remember at the very beginning of the story, Mr. Arble makes the statement that a little girl is one thing, but a runty pig is something else. And what he was stating was that people are special. God created people to be special. And the reason we're special is because people are created in God's image, of course. So there are going to be some Bible verses for you to look up to find out about why Fern would have been more special than just a little runty pig, even though he was a really fun pet for Fern. So there'll be all kinds of thinking questions and some interesting words for you to look up as we go through this story. But I hope you enjoy Charlotte's Web as much as I enjoy reading it. I'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.